Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is Vidhya Ananthakrishnan, and I am Director of the Youth Justice Initiatives Project at the Columbia Justice Lab. Really thrilled to see so many folks from across the country today joining this event and this panel on building the capacity of communities, families, and young people to keep themselves safe. As our previous panelists mentioned, the first block was really focused on sort of short-term issues right now that folks are dealing with and how we're thinking about those. And this set of panels, including ours, is going to be sort of talking more about the long term and how we can kind of see the forest through the trees, if you will. So with that, I want to turn it over to our main event, which is, again, as we talked about earlier, the current surge in gun violence, the public outcries to add facility capacity have made it kind of challenging right now to focus attention on what we think of as the long-term vision, which is really about creating a world where young people can thrive, flourish, and be safe within their own neighborhoods and communities. And yet we know it's more critical than ever that we actually advance that goal and ensure that communities become our default response and not continue to invest in solutions that are expensive and have not worked. So what it means to create this future is what we're going to focus on today in this panel. It's my absolute privilege and honor today to be joined by two amazing leaders in this space who have been committed to building community capacity. First, we have Cymone Fuller, Director of Impact Justice's Restorative Justice Project, where she leads the expansion of pre-charge restorative justice diversion programs across the country. Cymone has been working in the space for over a decade, starting by addressing the school-to-prison pipeline in her home state of Minnesota, where she analyzed the disproportionate push-out of young people of color, advocated for the revision of school discipline codes, and explored opportunities to bring best practices like restorative justice into the schools. She subsequently worked at both the Vera Institute of Justice and at the Justice Lab, where she focused on systemic reform in the youth criminal legal system and led work with sites to elevate strategies for investing in community-driven justice alternatives. Outside of her work with Impact Justice, Cymone is also an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City and a board member of the Stonewall Community Foundation. So we're really pleased to have Cymone with us. In addition to Cymone, we're thrilled to be joined by Albino Garcia, who's founder and executive director of La Plazita Institute in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which engages youth and their families in a comprehensive, holistic approach to youth and community development. Albino has lived and breathed this work for decades. In 1994, he founded the New School of Watsonville, designed to give youth a second chance for education in an alternative setting more conducive to their needs. He's also served as an educator, trainer, and community liaison for the Community Engagement Center at the University of New Mexico and a deputy director of training and youth development in New Mexico. He's received many awards, including the prestigious Kellogg Fellowship. Garcia is recognized as an outstanding leader and spiritual activist in New Mexico and was recently honored by the Rosebud Tribe. So we're really thrilled to have both of these panelists joining us today. In our conversation, we're going to aim to cover many of the different themes and questions that all of you raised during the registration process. This includes what it really looks like to serve young people in community, and some of that, a lot of the questions we received centered around the current surge in violence and how to sort of address that and be thoughtful about it in community settings, what kinds of supports and infrastructure that really takes, and what we mean by that sort of varied a lot across the question. Some of that had to do with funding, some of it had to do with having seats at the table. So, we're hoping we'll be able to touch on some of that. And then lastly, how do you really message for this kind of capacity and work with young people in their own homes, in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities to stakeholders right now, and make sure that they're sort of bought into taking this kind of approach. We know we're sort of facing those political headwinds that Nate referred to earlier, and we want to be thoughtful about what this looks like right now. So throughout the conversation today, we're going to be monitoring the chat. So we ask that you add your questions and comments there. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And as folks, hear this conversation and see questions come up or have resources they want to share, we ask that you go ahead and share them in the chat. We want folks to feel like they're getting answers to their questions. So please go ahead and do that. So with that, I want to turn it over to start our panel conversation. And again, really, really happy to have both Cymone and Albino here with us. So welcome to both of you. So I'm going to start with a question for both of you, which I already kind of alluded to earlier. Basically, during the registration process, we received a lot of questions about how to address and respond to violence and serious harm within communities, as well as how to address some of the systemic issues, including poverty, inequality, racism, that seem to be driving community violence. So in light of that, I thought it might be kind of useful if each of you could maybe talk about your organization's specific approach to working with youth and what it looks like and how it sort of relates to those things and how it might differ from typical other programs or approaches. So Cymone, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm going to start by trying to explain a bit about the role of Impact Justice's Restorative Justice project team that I lead, and then talk a bit about the work of our partners, which is really who is on the front lines doing the work of providing their communities with an alternative to meet the needs of folks that are looking for something that will allow them to access accountability and healing. So as far as our role at Impact Justice, I work with a team of 7 really mighty restorative justice practitioners, folks who have been a part of kind of reform work for a long time, folks who are really invested in capacity building and advocacy work. And together we support a network of partners across the country. At this point, we are working with about a dozen different communities that are really interested in figuring out something that can serve the needs that their communities have been going for decades without having a solution for, with needs that have been named over and over again, but haven't had any opportunity to be met through anything that's been offered through the criminal legal system. And so for us, our partnerships really are about building relationships with community-based organizations that are set in the communities where harm and violence are happening the most, and the district attorney partners who are usually the primary system partners for these programs. And that is so that these programs can be as front end as possible while still working with the level of harm that really requires there to be an identifiable person harmed, right? We know that diversion oftentimes is limited to very low level harms, right? It's really focusing on things that don't necessarily have a directly identifiable person on the other end of that harm. And for us, restorative justice is best suited for that relationship mending and that relationship strengthening that happens when harm happens between people. And so that's why the programs are really situated where they are and partner with the district attorney's offices. Our role is really to support that relationship building between the two, to kind of set an agreement on what the values are that folks want to be working with, what it is that they want to see happen in the program, what agreements they're going to use to determine things like eligibility for the types of harms that can be sent to the program. And what we are really trying to do is make sure that these programs do not replicate what we see many diversion programs do, which is they tend to overly benefit youth of color and under benefit kids of color who are prosecuted through the criminal legal system. So at the very beginning, we are working with partners to look at their data to identify what kinds of offenses are disproportionately driving kids of color into the system, what types of offenses are young people of color being prosecuted with the most, and making sure that those are the cases that are prioritized for being diverted into these programs. So we are doing things at the very beginning to make sure that we are attentive to race equity, and that we are not falling into the tropes that we've seen diversion programs fall into before, which is really limiting eligibility to make it really hard for young people of color to access diversion programs. Another thing that we're always attentive to is making sure that when folks have prior criminal legal system experience, that doesn't make them ineligible for these programs, because we know the history of targeting and how communities of colors oftentimes have the most contact with the criminal legal system, which doesn't necessarily mean that they should be ineligible for these types of programs. If anything, it means that they have been failed over and over again and should get a chance at something else. So that front layer of work is really about trying to concretize what will be the agreement for the program, and that usually results in a memorandum of understanding. And from there, the work is building capacity, or even just uplifting the capacity that already exists in communities. Sometimes we are invited in by community organizations that are already really well practiced in restorative practice and are really just trying to kind of figure out how to do the diversionary aspect to get more of their young people home and into their programs. Sometimes we're working with programs who don't necessarily come from restorative justice background, but are deeply, in community and are looking to add restorative justice to their capacity so that they can better serve young people and survivors of harm. We have training that both kind of equips our partners with restorative justice facilitation in a number of different ways. There's ways to build communities through restorative justice practice. There's ways to attend to harm in survivor circles, in circles with communities who are dealing with the impact of harm at the community level. And then ultimately, we are training them in a process called restorative community conferencing, which really allows for folks to bring folks through a supported and facilitated process into a space where they can actually talk about the harm that happened to them, talk about the needs that have arisen from that harm, and also the needs that are at the root of the harm that was caused, right? A lot of times, the way that we think about harm is limited to the idea that there is a person who causes harm and a person who's been harmed. And so much of our work and so much of what our communities already know is that that binary doesn't exist, that folks who cause harm have often been harmed and the cycle repeats. And so folks they go through a facilitated process where they identify people in their lives that can support them in their own healing and their accountability, generate a plan to make things right, and then are supported by the community-based organizations to complete that plan. And at the point that the plan is completed, the district attorney's office is notified and either no charges are filed. In some jurisdictions, that's possible and in the hands of the district attorney to make that choice. In other jurisdictions, the charges are dismissed if they had to go through a deferred prosecution route. So each jurisdiction is different, but in general, they're all operating with a similar type of model. And what we're usually trying to do is make sure that folks feel supported in implementing that work. So we are trying to create spaces for facilitators to have direct relationship with other facilitators and with our team to talk through the cases that they're facilitating, things that are coming up. To your point in your question, a lot of what does come up in those processes is the identification of needs that have gone unmet for a really long time, that are not necessarily just about the direct harm that brought them into the conference, but are about things like unstable housing, not being connected to quality education or employment, mental health concerns and needs that need to be addressed. And part of what makes restorative justice really valuable is that when it's held in community, people are invited into a space to tell the truth, to tell the fullness of what happened to them, the fullness of what may be motivated or was at the root of that harm that happened and what they need. And that allows for folks to start thinking about, as a community, how can we get folks connected to those things? Because community members and support people are brought into the process. So I'll close by saying that we are also at this point, because we're working with a national cohort of partners, really working to bring them together often and learn from each other often. So much of what programs will tell you is they feel kind of isolated in their work, right? They feel isolated in the idea that they're the only program pushing the limit on trying to get more serious harms into diversion programs. And what's great is that in a national collaborative, they are able to lean on each other and figure out, what did you use that brought your system partner on board for taking on this kind of harm? Or what did you do in this kind of case where this need came up? What did you think about? So there's collective sharing, collective problem solving that happens at that level. And it's only reinforcing what we know to be the case, which is that community, when brought into deeper relationship with community, can generate the right answers. So I'll pause there. Pass Albino.
Thank you so much. And just to kind of ask Albino to go ahead and talk a little bit about La Plazita, I think so much of what Cymone touched on was the importance of kind of getting to some of the root causes in the work that you're doing. And I know that's a lot of what you all are tackling as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about your approach that you're taking and how you're sort of thinking about community in that process.
Yeah, I think I heard you say, how we work with youth, et cetera, was in the and so hello everyone, Albino Garcia. Good to see everyone. I wish I actually, wasn't at the same time as Clinton and the other workshop, because I'm very interested in that one, so I think what we do with our youth, how we work with our youth, et cetera. We're old school interventionists. We come from the diversion, intervention, prevention, day, time and day and stuff like that. We create space and place. We always say we're a space-based, you know, uh, place for a space-based people with no space and no place, right? And so we create that. And what does that do? It enables, the sense of belonging, sense of identity, sense of culture, sense of familia, those kinds of things are what we try to create there at La Plazita. We are who we serve. So, my board, my staff, we make up over 100 years of incarceration. Employed there at my organization, more or less sometimes, depending on fluidity, etc. I think the biggest answer is old school time with our youth. That's probably our most valuable medicine, is spending time with our youth. And so that's what I tell all my staff, all my folks that work with us. If they're not spending time with us, they're going to be out there in the streets or wherever else, right? So we're kind of navigators. We have a cultural approach called Quinto Sol. So we work on self-determination, identity. Is a real big issue for a lot of our youth. So we have a cultural framework of self-identity, reinforcing the sense of family, like I said, where many of them have families who are incarcerated or are the source of some of the trauma they lived in their life, or current trauma. We become surrogate family for them at our place, and we teach them how to re-engage in a positive, meaningful sense of community, by finding ways to engage in the community that are productive and constructive rather than destructive. And then ultimately teach them how to navigate systems. That's where their greatest vulnerability is, and the perpetuation of trauma and harm, historically and contemporarily speaking. And so we try to, develop their life skills, their capacity to navigate all of the systems that can either eat them up, chew them up, spit them up, lock them up, kill them, or just help them, not just survive it, but learn how to thrive and reclaim the capacity to navigate those systems. Yeah, I'll leave it with that. And then, as far as like a little piece of, what Cymone was talking about, we also lift up, a lot of organizations at this time through the Casey Foundation. We're the recipients of substantial resources to pull our community together. So we have a collaborative called the Albuquerque Justice for Youth Community Collaborative, and it brings together about 26 organizations in Bernalillo County, in one way, shape, or form, serving system impact youth or families. And bringing those community members together is a job within itself. We've been dogging each other out, competing with one another for scraps and resources controlled by various systems and institutions. And thus we've learning how to regain our humanity towards one another and to build base and build power. I think collectively we serve, regularly over 30,000 people in Albuquerque as a collaborative in all our organizations capacities. So if we can serve 30,000 people, we can get 30,000 people to vote. We can sway, the way people, and who makes policy. So that's our next level. We want to build base. We want to build power. We want to build leadership. We want to build healing capacities. We want to build alternatives to detentions that are not usually considered that. The unusual suspect, so to speak. So, yeah, those are a few things.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think that was super helpful to kind of offer the background around how you're sort of seeing this sort of first level of providing service, sort of leading to a much broader vision, right? In terms of creating sort of a more long-term community vision where folks have power, have the ability to do what it is that they want to see in their lives. I want to turn a little bit to a conversation we had when we were preparing for this panel, which I think also came up a bit in the questions, which is, you both were noting how important it is, to have this sort of community capacity that's responsive to the needs of your communities, in part because of how public safety has traditionally been framed. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the historical context and how some of those earlier definitions of the term public and public safety kind of limited who was kept safe, and to what degree your programs now are starting to reverse those narratives and, helping to create that more culturally aware, racially just paradigm. Again, both of you touched upon it a bit, but I think it's worth kind of emphasizing here and why that's important. So I'll start with you, Albino, if that's okay.
Sure. Wow, the word historically is, that's a big one for us, right? And interestingly, when I think of historic and safety, it goes all the way back to colonization. It goes all the way back to the arrival of, Europeans here. And that's when, things started to change historically for us in the name of, what was, correct, or what was, safe public, safety of the public or issues for the public. And for us, that's where, mass incarceration started, right? With the, with colonization and so all the way back to the indigenous people of this continent. And then through the, the era of slavery, and then, all the way to contemporary times. And so I think for us, public safety is a loaded term. It's who owns the definition of public safety, and who defines it. What does it really mean? For us, public safety, is, I don't know, frankly, kind of an enemy of me, because it's, being safe from people like me and my people, and it's a false narrative, and it doesn't consider my safety. That's, to us, feels like propaganda, right? But it's used today, public safety, to determine how much how much time somebody's going to get, one of us is going to get. And so for us historically, what public are we talking about? The republic or me? And so I think, for me, our people historically have had difficulty, and I think even today, the work that we're doing in Albuquerque with our system and system stakeholders, et cetera, even our greatest colleagues and allies, it seems like when the issue of what public safety and how it's coined and how it's determined, it actually chains them. It actually handcuffs them. My allies, because it's more of a political narrative and a political, baton, and you beat people down with it. So, and it's really a beastly thing. You can't get out of that narrative. And if you go against it, you're like disloyal to the narrative and to the the political public. So I don't know. That's just a reaction. I'm sorry that I got
No,
from.
I hear you. Totally. I guess can I just ask you a quick follow-up, which is what have you had to do to help message in those moments, right? When folks are sort of chained by those narratives and, they still want to somehow be supportive, or can they be supportive? I think it's sort of connected, because I think right now there's a lot of people out there who are looking for ways to message to people who think that this type of approach might be soft on crime. So I'm just wondering how you've managed that when it's come up.
Yeah, I really feel that in our system, our system is made up, obviously, like everybody's system, it's made up of systems. It's multiple systems that make up the great institution and the system in quotes, right? So one of our systems, believe it or not, this would be odd maybe for me to say, maybe even for my own colleagues to hear, but I sympathize. I can't really empathize, but I sympathize for, like, for instance, our judicial court, folks, like our judges a little bit, because we have some pretty good judges in our jurisdiction, children's court, and the weight of political and media attack on crime, like I said, it's unpatriotic not to be tough on crime, especially during election years and stuff like that, right? So I think about the pressure to do what I have relationships with all of our juvenile court judges, and the pressure and the weight that they must feel, not to do what's right, but just the pressure that the media and everybody puts on certain cases that are high profile, et cetera. And to us, what's right is not popular. It's almost not even believed that we could have an alternative to just charging a kid as an adult, or giving them life. We're working on all those kinds of legislation. We've had some successes. It's not enough, but again, it's the pressure put on some of our allies, and frankly, some have caved, and some have taken consideration and are trying, but it's a big battle, and it's not only ours. So it's our colleagues and allies.
Thanks. That's helpful. Cymone, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to share or add to any of what Albino said.
Yeah, I mean, I I so appreciate Albino's just initial reaction to public safety as feeling something that's not ours, right? Like it just has never really felt like ours. And for a long time, I've been trying to kind of figure out how, even in these conversations about our criminal legal system and its responsibility for, or even the idea that it currently owns the narrative of public safety, I'm trying to figure out how we talk about public safety and safety without talking about the criminal legal system, because the two are not synonymous in my perspective, and in the communities that I am a part of and work with. If one thing that's been really interesting is to think about the term public safety in the context of public service and public good, because even in that, there is a history that I think can help us break out of what we understand public safety to be, or think about it in a more nuanced way. So if we think about the term public service and public good, those things were defined as non-rivalrous, non-excludable goods and services provided by government. And at the time that term and those services and goods were created, the definition of public at that time was pretty narrowly understood as white folks, right? And what we saw over time was that as communities became more integrated, folks moved away from the idea of public services and public goods and started shifting into privatized goods and privatized services to keep the services for a particular population of folks. And so even as we think about the public and public safety, the origin of public really kind of thought of public as a particular kind of person, as a particular demographic of our society. And the other thing that it makes me think about is the context that a public service exists in, which is the presence of other public services and public goods. There's not just one public service. There's not just one public good. Public services and public goods are things like transportation, sanitation, education, like things that are supposed to exist in every community in concert with each other. And we have really isolated public safety to think of it as this separate thing that's not dependent of or part of an ecosystem of other public services and public goods. And so if we think of it that way, then it really is interesting to consider why it is the case that communities that have the highest presence of public safety officials, law enforcement, have the biggest absence of quality public services in the other way, right? Poor education, poor sanitation, right? Those things do not exist when public safety, presence and officials and the enforcement of laws are, have the highest presence in a community. And so I wonder if we can actually move the term public safety towards the narrative that I think we all benefit from, which is actually thinking about public safety as part of an ecosystem of other things. Because safety is actually about the presence of so many things that communities that are experiencing the most violence do not have. And so if we can talk about that, I think we will be better suited. And I don't know if I froze a little bit because you froze for me, but hopefully that came through.
Yes, you did freeze a little bit, but I think it's okay. I think I caught the gist of what you were saying. I'm wondering actually if we can sort of move past this a bit to talk a little bit more about accountability. So that's another one of the things that came up a lot in many of the questions that we got, just in general. I think this is partially because, again, folks are super sensitive right now to the current climate that we're in, when this kind of rhetoric around law and order and safety is really high. And so I'm wondering, Cymone, if you could talk a bit about the work happening through the Restorative Justice Project to sort of help change the default mindset around punishment and incarceration as the path to accountability and safety, and what your work is really helping you and others understand about a different approach and why that matters and how you've sort of translated it.
Yeah, we have a system that has really rooted itself in components that actually prevent meaningful accountability from happening. And I'll just name a couple of those, because I think we are in a society that really equates accountability and punishment to be the same thing. And a part of our work with our partners is really trying to disentangle the two and really talk about what accountability is and how it cannot be punishment. And we actually have invested in a system that prevents it. So one way that the current system really prevents the opportunity for accountability is that it is rooted in the discouragement of truth-telling, right? From the very beginning, from the moment that somebody encounters law enforcement, the first thing that they're reminded of is that anything they say can and will be used against them. So immediately we are pushing people into a container that is going to prevent the truth from coming forward. We then go on to add in the role of attorneys, who their entire role is to create the most compelling narrative to win their case. So for defense attorneys, that often looks like encouraging their clients to not tell the full truth, really to pick pieces of the truth or completely rewrite the truth to make the most compelling, narrative for their side. For prosecutors, that often looks like not really leading with the truth of a survivor or what a survivor wants and actually creating a compelling narrative that will ultimately result in a conviction. And then overall, we are asking for us to really limit what we are considering and making a judgment of what justice looks like. We are really trying to narrow what is brought into a courtroom, what is understood about a particular harm, to make it not account for the full truth, not account for the nuances that exist oftentimes when harm happens. And that is how we've started things from the very beginning. We also choose to isolate. Our preferred method in our criminal legal system is to isolate people, whether that's through incarceration or, punitive conditions of community supervision, or, restrictions on where folks can and can't live, who they can and can't talk to. And that runs counter to what is important for our accountability to exist. People need to feel accountable to something. They need to feel accountable to a community. They need to feel accountable to a set of values and family. They need to feel a sense of belonging to something to then be held accountable to. And if what we've chosen to do is instead isolate people from the communities that they're going to need to have involved and engaged in order to hold them accountable moving forward, then we've really removed the opportunity for sustainable accountability. And the other thing we do is we shame. We shame people through this system. And shame is not a place where action exists. Shame needs to be transformed into guilt, and guilt is where action lives. So we have to allow people to move out of shame that is very paralyzing. It puts folks in a place where they need to hide, where they feel like they cannot come out and connect with people based on the shame that they hold. But when folks feel guilty, they feel pushed to act. They feel pushed to do sorry. And shame and guilt are really two sides of the same coin, but you have to move to guilt, to feel guilty for something that you've done in order to want to do something different or make right something that you've done. And we really, as a system, have decided to lock people into shame and not allow them to account for what they've done when they do feel guilty about it, when they have moved to the guilt side. So ultimately, I think we've got to do a better job of actually explaining what accountability is and how much we have built a system that really does not allow people to move into accountability. Accountability is not passive. And when you ask somebody to be completely removed from the community that they caused harm in, when they get to not have to really face the impacts of the harm that they cause and are not put in a position where they're actually, motivated or even allowed and activated to make things right, then we are not giving anybody a chance to be accountable. We are punishing people in a way to actually avoid and ignore what it will actually take to make things right. And so much of the things that we do as additional conditions of their confinement, of their release home, is limit what they're even capable of doing to make things right. And for survivors of harm, for the communities that want to welcome folks back in a way that they are accountable to their community, we are also robbing them of the chance for accountability and healing by investing in a system that is always going to prevent it.
How are you, Cymone? Can you hear me? How are you all thinking about metrics in terms of like once someone has sort of completed, the program and sort of seeing where they are down the road? How are you sort of looking at that and, seeing how they've maintained accountability, I guess, if that makes sense?
Well, the thing about restorative justice processes is that the metrics for accountability actually live with the community and the people that are harmed, right? So they kind of determine what accountability needs to look like. And so even though restorative justice does create far better results on metrics like recidivism and survivor satisfaction, which are very narrow descriptions of impact of what restorative justice can do, what restorative justice does do is it does create mended relationships or strengthens relationships or creates new relationships in community that then are able to create the conditions for preventing harm moving forward. It is one thing to say you are sorry and want to make things right directly to the person that you're harmed, but it's another thing to do that in the presence of people that you love and community members that you respect or that you want to make sure that you are still in right relationship with. And that's why the model of restorative justice work that our partners are using invites folks in, invites loved ones in, invites community members in, because it is important for folks to be invited into the role of accountability, of holding folks to accountability. And then the other things that we're trying to keep track of are the ways in which survivors will talk about how they feel supported by a community moving forward, right? Like a lot of the harm that happens to folks really within any kind of harm that they experience is the feeling of isolation. Like, this was just me. I am alone in this. I am carrying this on my own. And so much of what is necessary for their healing is to be seen and know that that is carried with others in their community. And that also allows folks in community to think about their role and even, what it looks like for people who experience harm to feel supported afterwards, right? And it just opens up a conversation generally in a community about what does it mean to be accountable to this community? What is it that we want to see be present for members of this community when something happens to them? And that is what allows for long-term sustainable change. So we're trying to do things like measure the amount of relationships repaired, but we're also trying to do like how many organizations are now invested in being a resource when people are harmed. How many new services have been identified, or how many barriers to eligibility for particular services have been removed now that they understand that it's critical for their community's healing. So it's comprehensive and it's hard to measure, but I think we do a disservice, especially to the complexity of restorative justice, by limiting the metrics to the criminal legal system. So we're trying to do a better job of learning from our partners about what are those magical moments that you see in this transformative process, and how do we start to measure those?
Yeah, I think that's super powerful and really, really important. Like this idea that how we think about success doesn't live necessarily in this like legal system framework, that it really is about this much larger investment that is about the capacity, right, that exists outside of that approach. And most of that is connected to relationships. So I think that's really, really important. Like a lot of what you describe, even at like if you kind of get to the root of it, the bottom line is like, how are people helping other people, right? And how are they supporting each other and holding each other up? So I really appreciate that. I want to turn to Albino and talk a little bit about a couple of other things that came up in the questions that we received, which was around, thinking about system stakeholders and ensuring that they are good partners for the work that you're doing. And I know we sort of touched on it earlier. I am curious if you could talk a bit about how you've partnered with different system agencies in your work, and to what extent have folks helped to legitimize what you're doing and help elevate what you're doing, and where hasn't that actually worked, and what would you have liked instead, I guess. So if you can touch upon that, I think those are some of the things that are on people's minds.
Right. May I touch a little bit on the accountability thing?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off from that.
Oh, no, that's okay. So that's another, trigger accountability. And what came up when, Cymone was talking, was, again, it's like, who owns the narrative? Who defines accountability? And for me, a thought came through my head right now, and is the childhood memory. I wasn't a church-going kid. I was pretty much a street kid. But some guys, from one of the local churches, I guess I caught their eye, and they invited me to their little service to eat. And I was like, yeah, cool, man, go see what they got to eat. And so I went to that little church, and it was kind of cool, because they didn't know who I was, and they didn't know my life. They didn't know all the craziness and madness of my life. And once in a while, I go by there and kind of hide out from my life, and they were kind of cool. But my mom started going there, and when she started going there, frankly, we was a little poor, and my mom used to dress up as best as she could to go to that church. And the sisters from that church, they had a certain way to present themselves, and my mom wasn't up to their par. And one day I came to church, and my mom was there, and the seats were all covered, so I was sat behind these ladies, 2 rows behind my mom, and I overheard them talking bad about my mom. And it really got to me. And so I got their attention, and I said, "That's my mom you're talking about." And they turned around and said, in Spanish, they said, "Ese muchacho tiene el demonio." That boy has a demon in him. He's evil. I tell you that story because the imprint of that lasted most of my life. And what I see in our kids today is this concept of good and evil, bad or good. And it all comes down to like accountability for us, like self-accountability, of complicity in those narratives. Cymone talked about guilt and shame. What a powerful tool, right? For trauma, to perpetuate trauma and harm. It to shame somebody, to feel or think that they're bad. Now imagine a whole nation of people being targeted and shamed, right? Constantly for hundreds of years. And so we have in our experience to like remove that seed, that implant of good and evil, and give it up like a bad drug. One day in a ceremony, I gave up guilt like it was a bad drug, because guilt landed on Plymouth Rock. It wasn't even part of our culture. You know what I mean? So accountability for me, first of all, is my own self-accountability. And how do I not be complicit to all of the tools of trauma, right? And the narrative that this whole who's accountable, and how do you make criminals accountable? How do you make people accountable? Where's the root of that? Where does it come from? So that's one. and then, your own complicity into that narrative. So that's self accountability. And then, the accountability of my own community members. Like the work we're doing today is like taking a real good look at ourselves in the mirror as a community and say, where are we complicit in perpetuating the indoctrination towards each other and trying to heal that? And then how do we make that the system itself be accountable for the perpetuation of trauma? When all the focus is going external, focusing on a bad deed or a criminal act or whatever, but never, how can those who perpetuate so much trauma not be accountable and yet hold up what accountability is? That to me makes me feel confused, and a lot of our people confused. So that's a little bit on accountability. The question of working with stakeholders and system, we realized that the system, as some of my colleagues I've noticed are on this call have said, for a long time, the system is doing what it's made to, what it was built to do. And so strategically, what we've been trying to do is take allies and that we believe that have good intentions, and that maybe have some credibility in their microsystems, probation, the courts, prosecution, detention, correction, the CYFD, the officials, and select who we feel is really someone that has good intentions, and then work with them, and then hopefully because they have a better chance. If we can incubate their leadership, then they have a better chance to influence their subsystems or their departments or agencies, right? And maybe they don't. Many of them are overwhelmed. Many of them just say, it's impossible. This system is so broken. We're just making money. That's all. But some of them really believe that they can make an influence, some change. And those are the folks that we're focusing on and we're working with, rather than try to take, the big gorilla and attack it as a whole. We're gonna infiltrate it, so to speak, and infiltrate it with good, well-meaning, intentioned people. And those are the people we will engage with, we will interface with, we will invite, and others we will not.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I think it actually speaks to something that seems common across all of the questions so far, which is, it comes down to people and those relationships where you feel sort of valued and trusted, whether you're talking about how you're engaging with young people and making sure that they're feeling connected and loved and supported, or, whether you're working with systems or thinking about, this larger approach to really creating communities where everybody is in space that they can heal together. It's about relationships. So I think that's very important to kind of take from this. I know earlier we talked a little bit, and this kind of touches on another key question around capacity building, which is funding. A lot of folks raised up that right now being able to build the kind of supports that they want to see for young people is really limited by funding and limited by the resources that are made available for this kind of work. And I'm wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about how you've been making the case for your work to different public and private partners, and how you've worked with different organizations to maximize your impact. I think you alluded to this a bit before, Albino. And then I guess more importantly, what kinds of things do you want to see the system and or philanthropic partners really embrace to make it easier for you to do your work? How can we use this as a moment to be thinking bigger about how funding happens, I guess. So I'll leave it to either of you to kick us off.
I'll just try to be short on my response, and I'd love to hear Cymone speak. So, so that's an interesting question again, boy. So this is a question that we're dealing with right now in Albuquerque, and that is what's the limitation of our imposed complicities? And like there's some complicity, like if we're not complicit, we don't get to play. And what I mean by that is, like, there are certain organizations in our collaborative that don't want to take any government money, no systems, no state, no federal, no city, no county money at all. They draw the line. And yet, how can they be part of a collaborative where we're trying to take money from the system and put it into community, so that the community can, be lifted up and resourced? And so that's why I think this initial, experiment with Casey was, put money in the community, and then see if we can leverage that and get money from, say the state, CYFD in our case, dedicated to community efforts. And it's been tough because there are some organizations that don't want to be complicit, to that. And so, how do we redirect the resources? So I have never taken money from a government agency, and I'll be 20 years next year, my organization, with someone else's terms. Like, we take it on our terms, we define it. And so we wrote up, a policy. We wrote up how, what this is, and we presented it to the CYFD, which is a $368 million budget, annual budget, and 77 million of that is JJ money. And they dedicated, of the 77 million annual money in New Mexico, 500,000 to go to community effort with us, So I don't know what percentage that is, but it's not a lot. To match what Casey Foundation is giving us, right? And still, the community, members of the community, are struggling with, it'll be on our terms, right? Is it really, though? So putting resources in community is almost like asking us to assimilate, and here we're trying to be self-determined. So it's a conflict, and you're danged if you do and danged if you don't. And we're struggling with that right now in all reality, in current time. And so how and where can we get resources to really build up community base and power, and not be beholden to the state or to the system in any way, shape, or form? I think is still to be determined where I'm from.
Okay. Cymone, we have like a minute left, so I don't know if you want to add anything.
I would second what Albino put forward, in that, like, it feels like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation that many communities are in. I think the one thing that we can do a better job of is, as system partners, really think about why money has to flow through the system to get to community, and all of the barriers and hoops that requires communities to jump through. We have seen so many of our partners, so much funding for restorative justice is becoming available now at the federal, state, local level. And while that should be a really exciting time, what we are also having to do is then fight for community held restorative justice to maintain, because funding is flowing through criminal legal system stakeholders, and they are using that money to, instead of support community-based restorative justice or community-based alternatives to what we know is a failed approach in the criminal legal system, they're doing things like building in-house restorative justice facilitation units, and they are rebranding restorative probation departments, and that money is not making its way to community. And even the ones that are attempting to do a direct partnership of funding with community-based organizations are saddling these hoops of procurement processes,